Live and in color from the NBC News radio broadcasting studios of KCAA, 1050 AM, 102.3 FM, and 106.5 FM, located in beautiful Southern California, and in parallel from the Turfs Up radio studio in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Thanks for tuning in to the Water Zone show this evening.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in this wonderful world. I hope everybody is having an awesome time. And we're going to do what we always do, talk about water, and we appreciate that you took the time to call in and tune in, and however you get us, whatever media, we appreciate that. Normally, we have Miss Chris Austin, who does our water news, and we also have Tara Malali, who's our co-host. But they happen to be at a conference that I'm not attending because can't all three of us go at the same time when we can't do the show if we're all gone. But anyway, they're at what's called the Aqua Spring Conference. And Aqua is the Association of Clean Water Administrators, and they're on doing their spring conference. So they went over there to do what they know how to do and talk about what they want to talk about, and left me here. So I'll do my best to keep the show going. But anyway, wanted to give a couple things before we start the show and bring in our featured guest. You know, somebody asked me the other day, what's the biggest water issue in the U.S. today? And to me, the most pressing water issue in the United States is a national what I call peak water security crisis. You know, where millions of Americans face declining access to clean, affordable water due to a combination of degrading infrastructure, accelerating climate change, and slow policy responses. And so why is it a big issue? People want to know that as well. Well, I was looking at stuff that Texas A&M University put out and other institutions. It shows that U.S. has passed a critical threshold in water security, meaning the system is under stress and cannot meet growing demand sustainability. And this is not just about broken pipes like we all know about. It's about human and social crisis affecting health, daily life, and equity. And there's several things that draw on that and cause it. One is what I call degrading infrastructure, aging water systems, lead pipes, outdated treatment plants, water, reduced quality and reliability. Those are some of the things. We also have climate change, which is a big factor, more frequent and severe droughts, floods, extreme heat, even disrupt water supply and increase contamination risks. That happens a lot. And then you have the sluggish policy responses, regulatory and funding gaps, slow reforms, and leaving vulnerable communities without adequate protection. So that's a big deal. You know, that drought that we're having here now and through the United States as of May 2026, 50.9% of the U.S. and 60.9% of the lower 48 states are in drought, and that affects over 150 million people. Now, you know, I go back to the sluggish policy performance. You know, you always dread when somebody says, we're from the government, we're here to help you. And if you take a look at all these plans for dams, for water treatment, for anything that has to do with water or anything else, it takes years and years to build a desal plant like they have in California. It took them 17 years from the time they asked to do it till it got turned on. 17 years. And I can tell you for sure that the price of what they said it was going to be 17 years back was nowhere close to what the finished price was. And, you know, when you see this kind of water problems that you have, you know, the vulnerable populations get attacked real quick, which I'm talking about the low-income households and historically marginalized communities. They're disproportionately affected, facing higher rates of water contamination, service shutouts, and exclusion from infrastructure segments. So those are the biggest things that meet this biggest water issue that we know that's happening. And you know, there's other things that I worry about is contamination in water. I also worry about safety of the water due to terrorists. About a year and a half ago, a water agency back in Philadelphia got hit by hackers, and they got into a treatment plant and was changing the mixing chemicals to cleanse and clean purify the water. Luckily, they caught it early enough, FBI got in there, and they found it was coming from Iran, interesting enough. So, it doesn't take much to contaminate water or a reservoir. You can take a little model airplane that's, battery powered, put a tube of Ceraphane. I'm not telling you how to do it. That's what I read. You put Ceraphane in the tube and fly it over a reservoir. It's open space. You're probably about 10 feet off the ground. Drop the Seraphine in, and you can kill 100,000 people instantly with that drug. So anyway, those are things that worry me, and that's why we see a lot of the crises that are happening with water. But all we can do is pray that we got a good enough government to foresee what's going to happen and execute a policy that they won't take that anymore and stop all this crisis that's going on. It's crazy, and I really believe that legal things and passing laws, I think, are all good. There has to be discussion, both sides, or three sides, whatever, how many sides we got these days. But what's really important to me is that they all get together with common sense and settle it for the best of the country, not just for a party or anything else. I don't vote for a party. I vote for the person, because that's really who's going to make the final decision in things. But collectively, when you got big things happening in the country, you got to have a gang of people that side with you. And the only way you can reach a good policy is to have the majority of the people agree to what you're doing. You're always going to have dissent somewhere, and that's the way the world works. Everybody has a different side to the situation, but you got to work together to make that happen. So anyway, those are the questions that I had come in on the wire here, and I thought I'd address those. But what we're going to do is take a small break, because we're going to have a good show. It's going to go a little longer than usual, but we're going to talk about reused produced water. And so what I'm going to ask everybody to do is stay patient, get a glass of water, do what you need to do for the next 60 seconds. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with our featured guest. So stick around.
Are you fed up crawling around, digging everywhere on the job site, trying to find those problems? Hi, my name's Sean, one of the coaches on the Site 1 training team. Today we're going to diagnose our solenoids using the ohm setting on our ProTrade multimeter. Very important, we have our controller off when we're checking for ohms. Then we make sure we're on the right setting using the right tool. We've got our ProTrade multimeter, we put it to the ohm setting, which is our upside down horseshoe. There's no polarity on a valve, so we can check either wire with either lead from our multimeter. We're looking for a reading between 20 and 60. Outside of that range, we've got to replace the solenoid. For more information on the ProTrade multimeter, or to pick up yours today, come on in to Site 1 or visit site1.com.
Water is one of the biggest expenses for communities, HOAs, universities, golf courses, and resorts. So keeping those costs under control, especially when rates are increasing while water supplies are being reduced, are often essential to a customer's survival. Managing water requires multiple skills, which is why it's been complicated and difficult until now. AquaTrack brings multiple skills and technologies together to help large system users conserve outdoor water and improve the health of their landscapes. AquaTrack's professionals are certified landscape water managers and certified landscape irrigation auditors. The company offers audit services, upgrade advice, technical expertise, and water use monitoring. We already manage irrigation water for the largest homeowner associations in Arizona, and we're prepared to bring our knowledge and experience to help others, including landscapers and designers. Give us a call and hear how AquaTrack saved one HOA some 430 million gallons of water and $200,000 in annual water expenses. AquaTrack is Arizona-based, and you can reach us at 623-594-8689. That's 623-594-8689.
Welcome back to the Water Zone. Thanks for tuning in. And again, we appreciate you dialing in and calling and everything else. And so what we have, we're going to do a continuation of what we call a series of reports on what's called New Mexico Produced Waters Consortium. And we have 4 people that we brought into the show, and these people are experts at what they do, and I'm very proud to work with them as far as on the radio side and getting them to come on the show. So let me introduce them to you. We have first Miss Jennifer Bradfute and Matthias Sayer, and they're co-founders of WATR Alliance, and that stands for Water Access Treatment and Reuse. We have Mr. Jonas Armstrong, who's Water Protection Division Director at the New Mexico Environmental Department. And we have Mr. Zach Stoll. He's the Assistant Director of the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, and that's based in New Mexico State University. And how I met these guys and lady we're doing this series. This is about the ninth show that we've done, and we're following the story because I think it's of great importance, and it's happening not only with them, but in other states like Texas and some other places. And we're going to get a good understanding of the legal things behind that. But what I want to do, since some of you might be new listeners, some of you may be old listeners, maybe get a little opening background about the water project. So I'm just going to ask Matthias if he could step in here and just give a quick brief of how this thing started, why did it start, and where are we today, and then we'll go forward with the questions. So Matthias?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. We're excited to continue talking about this opportunity in New Mexico in particular. So I'll be quick, but I do think some historical context is helpful to put today's conversation a bit in context, both our conversation here and the conversation that's ongoing in the state of New Mexico. In the late 2010s, 2017, 2018, at that point I was working for the state of New Mexico for the former governor administration at our Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. And at that point in time, we were starting to see an increase in the volume of applications for saltwater disposal wells. These are the wells that are used to manage the bulk of the volume of produced water in New Mexico and Texas. And so as we saw this uptick in applications, that obviously was happening alongside an uptick in the volume of oil and gas activity and production in the state. And we in dialoguing with operators, it was clear that this was the beginning of a wave of water that required a solution, and the solution at the time was saltwater disposal. But simultaneously, we were and continue to have conversations in the state of New Mexico about water scarcity. And so in that role I was in, working with folks who were then at the EPA, we started working on a white paper that examined the state of produced water, both from a regulatory standpoint and to some degree, a technical standpoint, trying to see, if the science were in a place where we could reuse treated produced water, what are the legal and regulatory policy and technical gaps that we need to be thinking about to try and potentially match this potential new supply, with the scarcity issue that we were dealing with in New Mexico. So we produced that white paper, and the end of 2018, and that led to, that was a few months before New Mexico passed legislation, which Jennifer Bradfute, who's my law partner and who I work with at the Water Alliance, was instrumental in helping both draft and move through the New Mexico legislature. And that piece of legislation helped answer so many of those gaps and questions and really create a solid legal and policy framework from which New Mexico has been able to move forward in how we are managing produced water today, and has created this regulatory opportunity to attempt to now use the science to treat the water and make it available for risk-appropriate uses. And that statute is really important. I think merits a bit of commentary from Jennifer just to help explain why that piece of legislation was so important.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about some regulatory and policy things. So, we'll go to Jennifer. Jennifer, you heard me talk a little bit earlier that things take a long time to get to be a regulation or a law and process. So how does the Produced Water Act, which I guess you refer to as HB 546, define and regulate produced water? How long did you work on that and other people work on it to get that passed?
Well, so the Produced Water Act itself actually moved pretty quickly. I was in a unique spot heading into 2019. I was working as a lawyer, and I had an opportunity to work with a lot of companies that were working on saltwater disposal wells and with a lot of oil and gas operators. And I, pun fully intended, I saw the wave of water coming. And I also saw an opportunity where there was a lot of consensus in New Mexico that people wanted to use produced water within the oil field for oil and gas operations, but there were legal barriers prohibiting that use. And the two big barriers that we didn't have answers to was ownership. So folks weren't sure if oil and gas operator, one, could sell or convey water, produced water, over to oil and gas operator two to use at oil and gas operator two's site. However, if they could do that, they could save a whole bunch of fresh water. And so everybody agreed they wanted to solve that problem and allow for broader use of produced water within oil and gas operations. The other issue that was prohibiting the use of produced water in oil and gas operations was liability. So just like they didn't understand ownership and whether it could be transferred, they also didn't understand how liability would transfer. So the Produced Water Act answered those questions, and now we don't hear a lot of questions about either of those issues. It was actually a very successful piece of legislation in answering those questions. Under New Mexico law, you can convey the water, and the operator can even do that for a fee. And when they convey that water, the produced water, over, the liability goes with it. So each person who has the water has to use it responsibly. And if they were to spill that produced water anywhere, they would be responsible for cleaning up the spill while they were handling the water themselves. And so that piece of legislation, that part of it, there was a ton of consensus. It brought a unanimous vote in the New Mexico House. We had a vast majority of the New Mexico Senate embrace the legislation, and it became a governor's bill and was signed into law by the governor very quickly. Following the enactment of that piece of legislation, we then worked on forming the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, and the research has taken more time to get that going and develop regulations for using produced water outside of the oil field.
Interesting. So do you believe that a shift in encouraging the reuse of produced water in drought-prone and high-demand oil and gas regulations, do you think there's a big shift going to happen or is happening in that? Because fracking is going to be going on. I mean, we want to dig up and pump up and, as the president says, drill, baby, drill. How is this going to affect that?
Yeah, and I'll let Matthias jump in here too, but, I mean, you have tons of water coming up in the Permian Basin. You'll have 8 to 10 barrels of water coming up, sometimes with 1 barrel of oil. We've got a ton of oil in this basin, and we need that oil to be produced, especially in times like we are facing right now where there's war and we're fighting about oil. So it makes sense. While this water is at the surface, and it's at the surface in some pretty dry areas of the nation, let's find a way to use it.
Good. Matthias, how does the New Mexico Produced Water Act define produced water?
The produced water is defined as it's defined in a couple places in the New Mexico statutory and regulatory scheme, but generally it's defined as the fluid byproduct of oil and gas production. So it's not a complex definition. It is a relatively complex water, but not a terribly complex definition. And in terms of what obligations does an operator? Jennifer mentioned that the statute clarifies ownership, and by clarifying ownership, it also clarifies liability. And so the statute really helped facilitate better contracting amongst parties involved in oil and gas production, with real clear language in the statute and subsequently in contract identifying who the responsible party is and what liability moves along the value chain as that water moves and changes in custody.
Okay. When you take a look at the desalination process, you get contaminated water coming up, what I call brine. Is that under the same regulation, or they have that's a separate one for a different process?
Brine and any fluid that is brought up through the oil and gas production process. So if it's a brine that's separated from the oil and gas production, then yes, it's all regulated under the Produced Water Act and enacting regulations as well. Brackish water, which is brought to the surface not through the production of oil and gas, is treated differently under the New Mexico statutory and regulatory framework.
Okay. So, Jennifer, what are the key differences between produced water use within the oil and gas sector versus off-field applications under New Mexico law?
Yeah. So produced water use within the oil and gas sector, years ago we used to talk about the amount of water you'd have to use in fracking operations. Now we're using primarily produced water, and we're not using fresh water. So that has not been controversial. You really don't have to heavily treat the water. So produced water has a lot of minerals in it. It's got a lot of salts and solids in it, and then it can have different chemical products in it, frac fluids that are put in it to go into the completions process when you're completing an oil and gas well. So when you want to reuse that produced water for another frac job, there's not a lot of treatment that happens, a little bit of treatment, but not a lot of treatment that happens to the water. When we look at using produced water outside of the oil field, and let's say you want to use it for data center cooling, so it's no longer going downhole in an oil and gas well, you're going to use it to cool a data center, you're going to need to treat that water to a purified water standard. And believe it or not, science has developed since 2019 through a lot of good work that Zach has done and his team has done over at the consortium, where you can treat produced water to be purified water levels, ultra, ultra, ultra clean. And that's what you can use for data center cooling. They need a highly purified, highly clean water. When you think about other outside the oil and gas field operations, if you can clean produced water to a purified standard, you can also remineralize it and use it for a whole host of other applications. And that becomes really important in the Permian Basin because you're getting sometimes, 8 to 10 barrels of water with every barrel of oil. So there's a whole lot of water there at the surface that you can treat. And the treatment technologies are being honed in on and refined, and you can get the water to a purified standard. So if you've got a whole lot of water that you can make really clean, then that's a prize out there, and we kind of want to go after that water because it's water that we want to use.
Could it be used for drinking?
Yes, it can be cleaned for drinking. Social license. So not controversial to stick it down hole for fracking, right? It does become pretty controversial when you talk about it for things like agriculture and drinking. And that's where we see a lot of resistance. So just like municipal plants, social license to use this water is going to have to be earned.
Okay. I know in Israel they do a lot of agriculture by using salinity-type water heavily in the process. But they found a way to work with some biologists, and they grow tons of crops, and it's amazing how they do it. So it's interesting to me. So you were mentioning about Texas and Wyoming. So how does New Mexico's approach compare to Texas or Wyoming in terms of permissiveness to produce the water, and what are some typical issues that you might be attached to?
Yeah, and that's a good question, Rob, and it's one that Jennifer and I have been working on the regulatory framework surrounding the reuse of treated produced water. It's one that as New Mexicans tends to frustrate us from time to time. Because as you ask, there are other states that are bringing produced water to the surface, and in the context of Wyoming and Texas, Wyoming has a regulatory framework, and there are treatment facilities in the state of Wyoming that have been treating produced water and discharging that clean distillate into surface water bodies. There a facility in the Pinedale area that was brought online in the late 2010s and treated and discharged water into a tributary of the Green River for the better part of a decade before the production waned and they stopped. The volumes no longer argued in favor of continuing to treat and discharge, and so that facility shut down. But for a good decade, they were treating water and putting it into a river. It was a blue ribbon and remains a blue ribbon trout fishery. In Texas, where they have, they're the largest producer of oil and gas and the largest producer of produced water in the country, and so they have a lot of water coming to the surface. Right now, the Texas statutory and regulatory framework there contemplates permits for reuse, and there are applications for discharge into surface water bodies pending before the Texas Council on Environmental Quality. There are applications before the Texas Railroad Commission for ground discharge for purposes of irrigation. And in the case of these Texas applications, if you look at what the applicants are requesting and aggregate the volumes across, the half dozen applications, we're looking at approximately 50,000 acre feet a year of treated distillate that could be approved for discharge into surface water bodies in West Texas. And the reason why I say that's frustrating is a frustrating dynamic for us in New Mexico is, we bring up, we'll call it around 7 million barrels a day of produced water to the surface. And a good portion of that, probably somewhere between 3 and 5 million barrels a day, is transported to Texas via infrastructure that is and is going in the ground. So pipelines are moving this produced water from New Mexico to Texas, and a lot of this New Mexico water will be treated and discharged into the Pecos River, which flows from New Mexico into Texas. And so we're essentially giving Texas water that we could use in New Mexico, but right now we just don't have the regulatory framework which allows for reuse. And so it really is a critical time in the state of New Mexico where we are examining the work products coming out of the New Mexico State University and the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium and other regional efforts examining and creating this really robust body of scientific research and trying to use that research to build a regulatory framework that contemplates, again, risk-appropriate reuse of treated produced water.
So I presume, I'm guessing that when you transfer water from New Mexico to Texas, somebody pays for the water to buy it, correct?
Well, it depends on... Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was going to say not always right now, because right now it's kind of seen more as a waste product. I think over time, as produced water starts to gain value, and people see that it really is cleaned up water, then it will have some economic value associated with it too.
I know in California, people hear the term potable and non-potable water, and they always think that non-potable water is costs less. Well, it has in the past, but since water is getting to be a shortage, I see the price of those things rising up pretty much, and so there is a value to non-potable water or produced water, I would say. But how does How does produced water management contribute to or exacerbate water into the surface water?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, as we see the produced water volumes in New Mexico, if we can encourage treatment of produced water, and we see several applicants applying for discharge permits into the Pecos River right on the Texas side of the New Mexico-Texas border, we're going to see a ton of water going into the Pecos River on the Texas side of the border, which is going to really increase surface water levels in Texas, which I think they plan to flow down and serve downstream communities throughout the state of Texas. So it will significantly contribute to water on that side of the state border. In New Mexico, what we will continue to see until we get regulations that allow for permits is we're going to see, just dwindling water flows. We expect to see 25% less water over the next 50 years throughout the state. And so we have a period of time to get it right before all the infrastructure just puts it right on the Texas side of the border. That being said, we need to get treatment right. And so we need to make sure our treatment technology is safe and in place to treat water correctly, because if the water is not treated correctly, when it goes into the Pecos, then it can have significant consequences, which is why we've spent a lot of time working with the New Mexico Environment Department on crafting the right types of water standards to protect health and the environment.
Are there, I assume I know the answer to this question, but are there legal standards or precedents for determining whether treated produced water is safe for humans or any other environmental exposure in New Mexico?
This is Jonas Armstrong from the New Mexico Environment Department. I'm happy to jump in on that question. We don't right now have existing standards in New Mexico specifically for treated produced water reuse. And any rule creating pathways for reuse, like Jennifer just described, has got to have such standards. So what we do have, and the Produced Water Research Consortium, Zach and his team have done a ton of work on this, is we have experts who have cast a wide net to identify what really, in terms of contaminants of concern, exist in New Mexico's produced water. And after identifying what those contaminants of concern are, looking to assess public health risks and identifying the basis for protective science-based standards. They're doing that work now. A lot of those can be based on existing standards for those chemicals from other existing regulations, either from New Mexico's surface or groundwater standards, drinking water standards, or such standards from other states or under federal rules. So it's not recreating the wheel. It's identifying what we need to worry about, looking to see what already exists in terms of what's protective of public health, and then adopting that in New Mexico rules that allow for pathways to safe reuse of treated produced water.
I know through this multiple series of shows that we've been doing about this, it really intrigues me. I honestly believe that the role that the pilot program is doing, like yours, plays an important role in forming the future policy and practice. I mean, I think you all believe in that, correct?
Yeah, and honestly, I think we're ready for more than pilot projects in New Mexico, and that's why we need to expand our water resources quickly, while, like we said, taking care to protect public and environmental health through science-based standards. So the consortium has been researching produced water treatment and reuse opportunities for years to get us here. Like I just said, we know what's in produced water in New Mexico. We know we can identify those contaminants both before and after treatment through targeted and non-targeted analysis. We know there are proven treatment technologies shown through research by New Mexico's consortium and other researchers in other oil-producing states and around the world. And that completed and ongoing research is giving us confidence at the Environment Department that there are opportunities for pathways for safe reuse of treated produced water. So, I appreciate the question about pilot programs, but like I said, I think we're ready to move beyond that.
there has to be a funding mechanism to the pilot programs and the research that you're doing. Where does the funding come from?
Well, the funding to actually do the project comes from, those entities who are interested in finding ways to reuse. So, companies who are produced water are supporting a lot of that research. There's also state funding to the Produced Water Research Consortium through New Mexico State University. But I think that there's a lot of motivation to find a way to safely, responsibly, like Jennifer described, pivot the understanding of this resource from a waste to something of value.
Right. Okay. I mean, for what you're doing, it costs money. I mean, you have a lot of people involved in it, and it's got to continue to get to the end need that you're looking for. What are some of the environmental safety issues that the process of produced water has to be concerned with?
I don't want to be repetitive, but I feel like I will be, because we have, like I said, just a really good sense of what's in this produced water in New Mexico. Different basins have different characteristics, but there's been a lot of analysis of produced water across New Mexico by the consortium. We know what's in there, so because we know what's in it, we know what the environmental concerns are, right? And so to address those concerns, we've got to establish those protective standards that Jennifer and I have both talked about. Like I said, the consortium's looked into this. I'm really looking forward to them having an opportunity to present that work to our state's Water Quality Control Commission. There should be a decision next week to hopefully schedule the petition that's in front of the commission for a hearing, where the consortium could present that research of how we can make sure that any rule addresses those environmental safety issues that you mentioned.
Okay, good. We get to some technical and engineering questions. I'm going to ask Zach to pop on in. Thanks for joining us, Zach. Appreciate you participating in this. What are the main components of produced water, and what are the typical treatment steps to make it suitable for reuse?
Hey, Rob. Good evening. And thanks for having me on. I've been on kind of the other side of this, listening for quite a while. And so it's kind of fun to be on the other end of it. To your question, I think it really depends on the basin. So produced water is kind of a complex fluid, right? Matthias defined it as kind of this byproduct from oil and gas operations. I might tweak that a little bit from my own perspective, because sometimes I think when people say, produced water is a byproduct, it sounds like it's kind of coming up out of nowhere, like we're taking this fresh water or something and transforming it into this waste stream. But, produced water is, a vast majority of it is naturally occurring kind of down underground, and it's commingled with the oil and gas, as well as the surrounding environment down there, the geology. And so, I think for this conversation, we're talking about the Permian Basin. So I'll start there. And the Permian, for your listeners, kind of covers southeast New Mexico into West Texas. But in general, this water is really pretty salty, somewhere around 3 to 4 times saltier than the ocean. And because this water has been down underground for millions of years, in contact with all that fun stuff, the oil, the gas, geology, it really takes on those characteristics. So there's a wide range of organics that are also kind of dissolved into the produced water. There's other compounds like ammonia. There's norm, which is naturally occurring radioactive material and heavy metals. So it's a whole soup of stuff. However, like others on the call have alluded to, there's the technology in place that can remove all of these. And really the canonical way that it's done in the desalination and water treatment space is you have a pre-treatment or a couple of pre-treatment steps up front that do some heavy lifting, and then you have the desalination process right after that does most of the heavy lifting, taking out a ton of those constituents. And then you have polishing equipment on the end for post-treatment.
Right. You also get into finding all kinds of rare earth minerals in some of this water that comes up, and that seems to be a big business. especially in the Permian Basin. I know they're looking for lithium and some other materials, magnesium and such. Um, I'm guessing that you have people that look into this and see what's available, and then develop a process to extract that, and then reuse it for whatever you need, or you resell it to somebody. I mean, so? What I'm saying is, you have a problem that you find, and you have a way to solve it. It's like using brine, and what can you do with brine? Can you turn it into something better? And what happens with those rare earth minerals? Do you do studies on those? I know we had a gentleman on the show, I think the last time, who was a geologist and was talking, a consultant. He was talking about, he goes around and samples and can tell you the amount of that process and the amount of the rare earth mineral. Do you see that as a money making situation, or a payback to offset costs of doing the produced water? That benefit?
I guess yeah, no, this is a great question. It's a super hot topic, and it's a really active area of research. And I'll give, I think, every engineer's favorite response, which is it depends. And so in areas where you have kind of these elevated concentrations of, your lithium or your rare earth elements, I think the technologies that are coming out of the lab and being commercialized right now, they're offering a couple of different new ways, right? New tools in the toolbox to kind of selectively extract those compounds in a more cost-effective way. And so that's really promising. We've definitely worked with a couple of lithium extraction companies that have had some really nice numbers and some really nice results in terms of doing kind of selective extraction. Rare earths are a little bit tougher. Typically, those rare earths should travel kind of with hydrocarbons. But it really depends. For some of the waters that we've seen, the rare earth element concentrations aren't super high, which means that, the economics aren't entirely favorable, even with these newer technologies and tools in the toolbox. But there are other compounds in the produced water that I think have value and that might have been overlooked. And so iodine is one of those. I had to look it up myself when I saw the news release, but I think there's a Canadian company that's exploring down in the Permian to selectively extract iodine. And iodine's really big in, I think, X-rays, or you eject it when you need to do an X-ray. It has some sort of medical application. Please support me.
No, that's correct. It's called part of the contrast. Would you go in and
that's
get
exactly
that for an MRI or that? Yes. I only read about that. I'm not a chemical engineer. My wife is a chemical engineer. I'm electronics and physics, but I do kind of understand that. And she always listens. She's probably listening to this right now because she thinks it's an interesting subject and something that she can understand much better than I can. But yeah, you're right. I agree with everything that you just said on that. How does the treatment technologies address salinity and oil residues, suspended solids, chemical contaminants? Because each facility, is it true that, well, I'm assuming, again, I don't know for sure, but every place that you're doing this, if you're doing it in multiple places, the composition of what's in that water and in the ground is different from place to place, pretty much, right? Or
correct. Yeah.
So everything has to be custom built to do the purification and treatment, I would assume, as well, right?
Sometimes, but to an extent, the general water quality, at least in the Permian, is pretty similar. It's not exactly the same, but I think it's similar enough where a lot of industry and people that are, the midstreams and entities that are doing treatment and exploring these really advanced treatment trains, you're able to kind of fit in similar technologies. Maybe you have to turn one part of it up a little bit more and another part down, or you have to swap out a certain resin for a different type of resin, but from what we've seen and what people are piloting right now, you have the stuff in the pre-treatment, which gets out a lot of your suspended solids. It really addresses a lot of the oily residues that you were talking about. And you get out things like iron and manganese, which are very sparingly soluble. And so if you don't get those out on the front end, they can really muck your process up downstream. And so that's kind of pre-treatment. And then for the desalination process, I'd say most folks are turning to a thermal process, where you essentially evaporate the water in the most thermodynamically favorable way that you can. So, capturing heat, recycling that heat, and then, trying to do things to keep the boiling point below, that 100 degrees Celsius. And there's different variations and ways you can do that. but that desalination process, I mean, that knocks out so much stuff. I listed the salinities and the heavy metals and the norms and the organics before, and I'd say 90 to 99% of most of those things come out. It's not perfect, right? Which is why you have the post treatment, and so those sneaky little organics that might carry over, or we see ammonia sneaking over into the distillate after you evaporate the water. Those things undergo post treatment, such as granular activated carbon, which is really like a ginormous Brita filter. Same type of material, and then a zeolite or like an ion exchange material after that, and then usually the water quality is pretty clean. And so when we have gone out and sampled from these pilots that are operating in the field, and we take this highly treated, purified water back to the lab and we test it for toxicity, we're finding that the water is not toxic, which is pretty crazy. I mean, this is one of the, I'd say, most challenging waters I've ever seen as a water treatment engineer. And for people to take it from what it is coming out of the ground to this highly purified level is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it truly is. And again, I'm not in the field. I don't specialize in what you guys do, but my wife. I go to her after each session that we do, and she helps me out and explain things to me a little bit in more depth. So I appreciate her for that. But so, what are the technical and economic feasibility challenges of utilizing the produced water for beneficial purposes like industrial processes, agriculture, etc.?
That's a good one. On the technical front, we see a lot of entities mostly using conventional and existing treatment technologies. So it's not really a question of do we have the right technologies to do this. I think we do have them. We've had them for a while. And people are just putting those puzzle pieces together in a different way to get the water quality that we think we need for safe discharge, or that industry thinks it needs for safe discharge. So it can definitely be done, but there's tons of room for innovation. And so there's some really cool companies out there that instead of evaporating the water, they're freezing the water, which I thought was really interesting. I guess thermodynamically, it takes less energy to freeze the water than it does to evaporate it, which is pretty cool. So that's a nice example on the technical side. One of the big questions on the technical side, I think, that still remains is, and this probably is what Jonas was referring to a little bit, but having right now we've got a lot of what are called pilot systems out in the field, and so they're not small things you would put in the lab. They're definitely getting pretty big out in the field, but they're not quite full scale or full size yet. And so going and making that jump from pilot scale to this full scale, things can change, right? The way you operate it, the way that those systems behave, surface area to volume ratios, all these engineering parameters could change. And so being able to scale up and operate those facilities for a long period of time, I mean, in the order of years, and do so reliably, I think is that next big challenge that folks out there are trying to tackle. I guess go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of the economics, the treatment is getting very cost competitive to what is being done today. So, right now the produced water pretty much comes out of the ground and it's injected into these really deep disposal wells called the SWDs, or saltwater disposal wells. But the treatment, the technologies are improving, but with all of these kind of first of a kind systems, these first pilots are, of course, more expensive, right? But we're already seeing iterations and innovations that are starting to drive that cost down. And I think as people continue to develop these technologies, scale up the size, right, go from the pilot to the full scale, those costs are going to come down and probably going to be at parity or less than disposal.
So who has ownership? I know we talked about this before, but who has the real ownership of rare earth minerals? Is it the landowner, the leasee, state or federal government, and can any one of them just come in and take it?
Yeah, Rob, that's a really important question, and there's no real easy answer to that question, because the question really does depend on geography. It's going to be a little bit different answer whether you're in Texas, New Mexico, elsewhere, and so if in Texas. If we look at, there's recent case law which clarifies the ownership of the produced water, and it established that the produced water runs with the mineral estate. That case law did not address minerals entrained in the water, but if we look at other relevant case law and put them together, I think we can see a trend where it's likely that minerals entrained in the water, whether dissolved or solid, would likely be found to be part of the mineral estate. And so whoever owns the minerals that have been produced would own, and the minerals that are contained in the produced water would own those minerals. What we don't have right now in most cases are leases and operating agreements where the ownership of that minerals and the value derived from potential mineral sales is contemplated. So there will need to be, some recontracting and new kind of analysis of that type of transaction. On the New Mexico side, I would say it's much less clear. As Jennifer mentioned, the relevant statutory framework establishes that the operator who produces the oil and gas and the water that comes with the oil and gas has a possessory interest, they don't have an ownership necessarily. And so I think it's less clear in New Mexico who owns the minerals entrained in the water. Also more complex in New Mexico because we have private minerals, we have federal minerals, we have state minerals, and so it's a more complex and checkerboarded landscape. And I think if we look at historical precedent in federal cases, we would see a probably likely outcome that minerals entrained in produced water in New Mexico that are producing federal minerals, federal oil and gas that entrained minerals in the water, that the federal government would ultimately own those. I think we'd probably see a similar conclusion for minerals owned by the state of New Mexico and managed by the New Mexico State Land Office. And so it's a complex kind of arrangement, and one that I think we'll see greater clarity over the coming years as parties write contracts, adjust leases, and we will probably see at some point some jurisprudence helping provide some clarity or additional clarity.
I got to hang with you guys more often because I'm learning so much, and so are our listeners about all this. I mean, I can read a whole bunch of things, but you're the ones with hands-on, and you knowing what's going on. One last question. Where do you, and anyone can answer this, or you may have separate opinions on, what do you think the future of water is for the U.S.? Where do you see the future of water?
I'll jump in on this. I think, Rob, my 2 cents is we're running out of fresh water, or we've already run out of fresh water in a lot of areas. And so the only way you're going to get a stable supply of water that's cleaned is by treating and repurposing all the different wastewaters that we've created.
I agree to that. And anyway, I enjoy these sessions talking to you guys. And like I said, I've learned so much more than when I read other things. You guys are right in the thick of things, and you understand it. That's your business. You understand it very well. And I'm just amazed at the efforts and things that you're doing. We're going to keep on doing this series and follow this all the way through until you guys tell me, hey, success, you acquired everything you want, and you move even further. So I appreciate that. Any new exciting things coming up for you guys, or are you just waiting for some process in the courts to help you out and some other things? We got 1 minute left on the show, so I just want to throw that out. If anybody has anything to add to that, if not, just let me know.
I'll jump in real quick. Jennifer and I, on behalf of the Water Alliance, have been, as you mentioned, moving a petition for rulemaking through the New Mexico Water Quality Control Commission. And the commission is meeting next Tuesday to, as Jonas mentioned, take a vote on whether or not they will set the petition for hearing, at which, if they decide to do so, there would be a hearing where the latest body of scientific research would essentially be presented to the commission, and they would be asked to vote on whether or not to adopt the draft rule which we have proposed, which again establishes a permitting regime for the reuse of treated produced water. So it's a big moment for this water source in the state of New Mexico, and we're excited to present some of this to the Water Quality Control Commission.
Great. Well, I got to terminate this real quick because we have to turn this over to NBC for their news hour. We do appreciate you taking the time to come on. I hope you can come back with some more things as we progress on this process that you're doing. And thank you all for participating, and you have a good week.
NBC News on KCAA Loma Linda, sponsored by Teamsters Local 1932, protecting the future of working families. Teamsters1932.org.
NBC News Radio, I'm Jim Roop. The U.S. says Iran attacked 3 of its Navy ships in the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM saying it intercepted the attacks, calling them unprovoked. In response, the U.S. targeted sites